Good evening. My name is Edward Sanshin Oberholtzer. I'm the resident priest and guiding teacher of the Joseph Priestley Zen Sangha here in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. We're a part of Empty Moon Zen. The elderly 15th century Zen priest, Ikkyu Sojun, wrote a poem dedicated to a much younger, blind singer with whom he was in love. It was entitled, "Written out of desire to thank Lady Mori for her profound blessings." And it goes, "The tree withers, leaves fall, spring returns again. The long green stems give birth to flowers, old vows are renewed. Ah, Mori, your profound blessings. If I ever forget and turn away for a million measureless kalpas, I'll be reborn as an animal." Jim Harrison responded to this in his poem after Ikkyu. "The monk is 87. There's no fat left on his feet to defend against stones. He forgot his hat, larger in recent years. By a creek, he sees a woman he saw 50 summers before. Somehow, still a girl to him. Once again his hands tremble when she gives him a tin cup of water." My teacher, James Ford, is both a Soto Zen priest and a semi-retired Unitarian Universalist minister. When he left the First Unitarian Church in Providence, Rhode Island, he moved back to California. A few years ago, a local UU church in Long Beach began their search for an interim minister. The chair of the search committee asked James if he could suggest 5 questions to ask candidates. And, as luck would have it, that request came just before James and I were to meet for our bi-weekly talk by video conference. This was some years ago, before the days of Zoom, back when we still used Skype. After a brief check-in, James, as is his wont, asked me what questions I would use. Stalling for time, I threw out, "Are you a cat or a dog person?" This strikes me as getting to the heart of a person's true nature, and is a great place for a job interview to begin. The next 2 questions came out of my then current life as a librarian, and were, frankly, just throwaways. I always relied on the New York Times Sunday Book Review when ordering books for the library, and I especially liked the column, "Buy the Book," a weekly interview with a writer that almost always includes the question, "What books are on your nightstand?" Next, of course, the question Katie Couric asked of Sarah Palin, for me one of the highlights of the 2008 presidential campaign. "What news magazines do you read?" Of course, there had to be meatier questions, though I still think those first 3 show a job candidate for what they really are. So the next question went, "A clearly drunk person approaches you on the sidewalk and asks for change for a cup of coffee. What do you do? Why? Why not?" Now, James particularly liked that one. But then, finally, perhaps inspired by a raft of stories of clerical sexual abuse, I suggested throwing out a koan as the start of a discussion. In particular, case 162 of the Rinzai collection of koans, Entangling Vines, the koan known as "An Old Woman Burns Down a Hermitage." Now, though it is no doubt both wildly exaggerated and completely apocryphal, there's said to be about 1,700 koans in all, dialogues between Zen teachers and their students, between 2 Zen teachers, folktales, bits of liturgy, all used as a marvelous kind of technology opening us to enlightenment. Different schools use different subsets of that total, often 400 to 600, a number probably closer to the actual koan total. In my school, we have around 500. Out of those alleged 1,700 or 600 or 500, whatever there are arguably only 2 that touch upon sex or sexuality. Only one counted in the number of koans I sat with. The other was that koan found in Entangling Vines. An old woman burns down a hermitage. There are formal ways of approaching and working with a koan in Zen practice, and there are informal ways of using a koan as a point of departure for a conversation. This seemed like a good seed for a far-ranging discussion about sex in the context of the ministry, and so let me lay it out for you. There was an old woman who supported a hermit. For 20 years, she always had a village girl, 16 or 17 years old, take the hermit his food and wait on him. One day, she told the girl to give the monk a close hug, look in his face and ask, "What do you feel just now?" The hermit responded, "An old tree on a cold cliff, midwinter, no warmth." The girl went back and told this to the old woman. The woman said, "For 20 years I've supported this vulgar good-for-nothing." So saying, she threw the monk out and burned down the hermitage. Probably not the ending you were expecting. In working with koans, you're often asked to become one of the characters in the story, the old woman, the monk, the girl, the hut. So many points to consider, but just what response would have satisfied the old woman? And there was Ikkyu, an old man, an old monk, and his response, his poem to his beloved. The tree withers, leaves fall, spring returns again. The long green stems give birth to flowers, old vows are renewed. The long green stems give birth to flowers. Ikkyu, no stranger to hermitages, was not one to be left hanging on a cold cliff face. But let me leave it there for now and tell another story. A number of years ago, I was the head monk, the Shuso, during a long retreat at a Zen temple in Worcester, Massachusetts. One morning, the co-abbots had invited a fellow Zen teacher to give a talk. I've no memory what he talked about, but when it was over, during the question-answer period, he was asked how, as a teacher, he handled feeling sexually attracted to a student. "It's never happened," he responded, and went on to make clear that the notion of feeling any attraction for a student was just inconceivable to him. Later that afternoon, after he'd left, one of the co-abbots expressed his surprise and his deep sadness that the visitor seemed so out of touch with his own feelings. Not to be acted upon, but to be acknowledged. An old tree on a cold cliff, midwinter, no warmth. The core of Zen practice, of any person, needs to be rooted in a recognition of our own embodied nature, and that embodied nature brings with it desire. A desire needs to be acknowledged rather than buried where it can fester. And this brings me to that second koan, the one in our own curriculum. It's the third question of Sunyon's 3 turning words. Why is it that someone of great awakening does not cut off the red thread? What is this red thread, and Why does a person of great awakening not cut it off? Blood, passion, feeling, that embodied source of intimacy. Cut it off and you cut off human feeling. Cut it off and you cut off the possibility of empathy. Let it run free and you risk disaster. The very opposite of an old withered tree on a cold cliff. That old woman's anger came when she realized that 20 years of practice had left the monk with no sense of his own humanity. Is this dancing on a knife's edge? Of course. But then all of life is dancing on a knife's edge. There are always shadows. There will always be shadows. It is for us to recognize them, and when we don't, when we come close to falling, to be willing to rely on the community to point them out to us. Ikkyu danced on that knife's edge, seeing the hypocrisy of clergy in his own time and choosing to embrace taverns and brothels. A stronger man than I. In a time of devastating wars and famine, Ikkyu, fallen and redeemed, a true bodhisattva, chose the sorrows of samsara, singing the Dharma and the joys of his lover, Mori. One of the koans in our way is, how is my hand like Buddha's hand? We find it in the three turning words of Oryo Enan. In our collection that our school refers to as the miscellaneous koans, an invitation to our own true nature. Ikkyu took that invitation and wrote, calling my hand Mori's hand. How does my hand resemble Mori's hand? I believe the lady is a Furyu master. When I'm sick, she makes my jade stalk sprout, delighting all my assembly. An invitation to Ikkyu's own true nature, his own original face. So, somewhere between the cold of a cliff in midwinter and the warmth of the red thread lies a middle way, and it's for us to stumble our way towards it in hope of finding our own humanity.